I'll try to be as concise as an Irishman can, but this story starts with us about 40 years ago when I was a big believer that the original diet of man was fruit. It is a perfect food. And by the way, I'm a greater believer in that now from the brilliant work of the anthropologist Dr. Richard Leakey, who basically was the first scientist in human history that did the homework that anthropologists should have done hundreds of years ago. He looked at the teeth. Looked at the teeth of pre-Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens right up to now, and it is concise that we were fruit eaters and green eaters, period. We didn't even eat nuts, seeds, grains, and beans other than when there were long-term droughts. And he was wise enough to bring geologists and say, why are there greater indentations there? And ironically and amazingly, it was a period of time those droughts went on. Now, 40 years ago, we are on the front line of catastrophic disease. And we don't have a private practice for common colds and baby births. So our institute is best known for people coming from around the world for 6.5 decades and reversing catastrophic cancers. There's people sitting in this room with you that were dying and came to us years ago, was told by Sloan Kettering they're going to die, stage 4 cancer, and they're well today. Not because there's magic in going on, but because what Anna Maria said, we live by. My integrity, my passion is about keeping up with what we now know, not holding the mantle of what I knew 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's not my interest anymore. So I would see visible cancers, like breast tumors specifically, enlarge when we were giving carrot beet juice, which is high fructose, very high, and mangoes. And, I was eating 50, 60% of my diet because I, like you, am a flaming sugar addict. I'm just a recovering sugar addict at this point. When you talk about watermelon, I would eat the whole watermelon. That's not a joke. I'm an American watermelon, not these petite little things. I would have bought 10 of those and eaten them. And when we saw several of these women and men with visible cancers grow when we were giving them sugar, I went nuts and looked at every possible thing I could, and it wasn't in the literature. And now Gabriel's pointing out that there's 8 studies that were hard to find, but there were none. And I went completely bonkers. I was sneaking into medical libraries because this was our mantra. Remember, this was Hippocrates' mantra, fruits and vegetables, and mostly fruits. And carrot juice is great, and beet juice is great. And I'm in a position when I'm the director that people's lives are at stake. I'm not an employee anymore. People's lives are at stake. And finally, I was exhausted and almost gave up. I was on a plane going to LAX where I was going to lecture at the University of California that night. And the man next to me, being a typical American, said, "What do you do?" And when Anna came to this country, she couldn't figure out why Americans were so bold to ask what you do. I said, "We're very shallow. That's the way we evaluate you." So we taught Anna Maria to tell everyone she was a garbage collector in a deep Swedish accent. "I was a garbage." They move away. That pretty young girl, garbage. And I mumbled, I direct an alternative health center in Boston. He got lit up and he said, "Was it Hippocrates?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "My aunt went there. She healed bone cancer." "Oh my God, it's wonderful." I said, "What do you do to be polite?" He said, "An agricultural scientist, my expertise in fruit, University of California." He was sorry, he opened his mouth. I almost asked the pilot, "Don't land." I was draining every bit of information, and that's the mother lode. So the agricultural scientists and agricultural historians tell us that we started to hybrid fruit to gain more sugar millennia ago. We're not talking about last year or genetic modification of it today. We're talking about thousands of years, and the Chinese were the experts in it. Why? Because they were marketing this fruit, and they noticed the guy at the market that had the sweetest fruit sold out every month or every week, and the guy that had sour fruit didn't, so they started to mess with it and hybrid. The second problem we have, and I mentioned this yesterday in my lecture, in menopause, is that we basically didn't eat sugar, processed sugar, other than a handful of very wealthy people a century ago. And most of you don't look like you come from that ilk. So it was pretty much moms, dads, and queens and princesses, and they were eating massive amounts of nothing. 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds a year. The rest of us didn't do it. All at once it flipped, Your government subsidized the drug industry, called the sugar industry, all over the globe, by the way, you listening in Europe and all over the world, and made it so this commodity became so inexpensive that the poorest people among us today eat the most sugar. You have this little wonderful organ in your body that regulates sugar because we were fruit eaters, fruitarians to begin with, and balances it so that it can be entered into glucose into the cell, which is an incredibly important fuel for everything. Every cell in your body needs glucose. Now, to answer your question, Stephen, it's about amounts. Lettuce has sugar in it. How many of you know that? Greens have sugar in it, but very small amounts. So when I found this out, I felt liberated and have spent the last 39 years looking at this and applying it. And we finally got allies. A man who sat next to us on this very stage last year, who's the man I would absolutely tell you is the most important man in the history of cancer research, Thomas Seyfried. Let's give him a hand. And every once in a while, when we find out there's incredibly smart people in a subject, we invite them to the Hippocrates Institute, and we have science events. And we call them food as medicine events. And we ask Thomas to come there with Dr. Yu, the people who came up with the ketogenic diet we brought there, the top brain surgeon in America, who's one of us, brought there. And it's a love fest for 3 days, because all of these women and men are being so scrutinized, they're about ready to lose their tenures and their money, and sometimes even more than that, but they're willing to tell the truth, because they are real doctors, they are real scientists, they are real researchers, and they're not doing this for any other reason, but they're passionate about it. And when Seyfried found out we hadn't served fruit for anyone sick at the Institute for 40 years, he was elated that we were such brilliant scientists, and I said, dumb luck. I saw 4 or 5 or 6 women's tumors go up and go down when I took away the sugar. He said, well, here's why. And he sat down and spent 3.5 hours with me on a card about this big, explaining the metabolism of fruit sugar. Now let's go back to what Gabriel mentioned about 22 minutes ago. He is correct that we now know that the worst of all sugar to feed cancers and brain problems is fruit sugar. It is amplified by a minimum of 10 times more than glucose, which totally is about 400 to 500 times worse than not having the sugar. Now, this is not an opinion. We're talking about real, hardcore science. Now, some of you may say, well, I'm not having cancer. Well, the number of people in the United States that will contract some form of cancer in your life is 57%. So, no, you don't have cancer now, but there's a 57% chance for the average American you're going to end up with some form of cancer. Now, I'm not going to labor on that, but we're going to keep going. So when we pulled it out, we saw clinically that people started to get well who were not getting well, and they were getting well at about a 3-time faster rate. But within a year, we pulled it out of everyone with viruses, everyone with bacteria, everyone with fungal and yeast problems, and everyone with low and high blood sugars. And by the way, some of those disorders were much more rapid than 3 times faster, including diabetes. I've never worked with a type 2 diabetic who does what she or he should long enough that doesn't reverse it, because it's not a disease, it's a lifestyle choice. If you don't change your lifestyle, you're going to have diabetic type 2. If you do, you won't have diabetic type 2. Type 1 is different, and Gabriel will tell you probably the same, because he works extensively with diabetes. Matter of fact, how many clinics do you have around the world right now, Gabriel, that you're putting loving energy in and dedication to?
Well, besides U.S., in a week I'm going to
You might
Brazil. Besides U.S., in a few days I'm going to Brazil where we're doing it, and we also are doing it at least once a year, going to twice a year in Israel, which serves all of Europe. And that's enough.
So even type 1 diabetics in some cases can reverse it, as the case study that he mentioned, but that's not a done deal. 3 out of 10 you don't get far with. They may have less eyesight problems, neurological problems, etc. 4 out of 10 you're going to dramatically reduce insulin intake, and 3 out of 10 have a potential to come off it. But they've got to be really good at what they do. So let's talk about berries. I mentioned that today if you were here, and if not, I'll repeat it. Berries are amazingly good because of phytonutrients, phytochemicals. The original studies were done up at Tufts. A couple of my colleagues were part of those studies, and now globally. There were about 182 studies as of 2 months ago that were done. But the seeds of the berries are purchasable, less expensive, and extremely effective compared to the berry itself. When you have a diabetic problem, a dementia problem, a fungal problem, a yeast problem, a cancer problem, a low blood sugar or high blood sugar problem. So the phytochemicals are dramatically higher in the seeds. And you can take them in some, if you're really industrious, you may want to sprout them, and if not, do what I do, you powder them up and put them on your salad or in a juice or something like that. Number two, you have to remember that when we look at these things, there is definite clinical reasons we believe these things. It's not as if I only read empirical evidence and only do what empirical evidence says. Matter of fact, I think almost all science is bogus. Let's be honest with you. The majority of science, somebody comes with a check and literally says, this is the outcome I want, and of course that group of scientists basically make that outcome happen. Now, very rarely does somebody give a large check and say, help humanity, do what you can. So if you really look at who funds these studies, even good-natured people doing good things who are purporting that they're supporting plant-based living, I congratulate them, but those studies can be manipulated. That's why I only read meta-studies now. Meta-studies are they've done 10, 20, 100, 200 studies, and they may have 200 outcomes, but what we literally see is that they find the same thing in 200 studies, they just don't report that. The outcome's different. Because the check basically said, that's the outcome we want. But I'm not against science, I'm just against most science at this point. So when I see people's tumors grow, and when I see diabetics get well 3, 4 times, 5 times faster than they did when I had them on fruit and carrot juice, when I see people who have dementia actually halt dementia, and there's many other things, B12 supplementation, essential fat acid, we have a whole department called the energy medicine department that literally is so advanced that eventually somebody will catch up with this thing, not because we're advanced. We just don't believe that chemistry is the answer anymore. We believe electromagnetic frequency is the answer. And when we combine it with chemistry, with our IV department, our hyperbaric department, et cetera, it's monstrously effective compared to just the chemical part of it. So with that said, congratulations to the anthropologists that tell us we were fruit eaters. Sadly, fruit now is 30, 40, 50 times sweeter than the original fruit. Once again, we'll report to you that the average fruit is 30, 40, 50 times. And of course, as much as I like sugar, when I looked at the orange I liked the most, Honeybell, it was actually 56 times sweeter than the original orange. The apples that we like, which may not bring the glycemic up because it slowly comes in, as they did the work at Stanford on that in University of California. But the fact is, all sugars at any level are not good for you when it gets to spill into the bloodstream and starts to precipitate the growth of any disorder.